Hi, I'm Jacob Halbren, the editor of the National Interest magazine, and it is my great pleasure today to welcome Graham Allison, who is the Douglas Dillon Professor at Harvard University at the Belfer Center and a valued contributor to the National Interest, both to the magazine and the website. Graham is also the author of the famous book, Essence of Decision, about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this prompted me to think that it might be a valuable Zoom session to discuss with him what, if any, are the actual lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and going even further afield, World War I for our current standoff with Russian President Vladimir Putin over the fate of Ukraine. There have been a number of historical analogies have been floating around. Some people are calling for the Finlandization of Ukraine. Others are calling for a new Austrian solution on the lines of the agreement that led to the departure of Soviet troops under Nikita Khrushchev from Austria and the end of its four-power status. And then there's the Cuban Missile Crisis. Just this morning, David Ignatius in the Washington Post argued that the Cuban Missile Crisis is now occurring in reverse, that Moscow is Washington and Washington is Moscow. What he meant was that the Russians have far more at stake in Ukraine than the United States. And that's why they're prepared to go to the mat in Ukraine, unlike the Biden administration. With that, I'd like to welcome Graham to begin his initial remarks on what, if any, are the parallels with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and is there a diplomatic solution, such as the one that occurred at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, that could be valuable for today? Graham, please take it away.
So thank you very much, Jacob, and thanks to the National Interest for stopping to think about learning from history. This is, in the local language here, applied history, and I think that there's no question that by reasoning from historical analogs, we can at least find some clues to help us illuminate the current challenges and choices. So first, with respect to Cuba, if we were giving a lecture, I'd give you a dozen lessons. Let me just take three off the top. So the first is the peril of strategic narcissism and the necessity for strategic empathy, two terms that H.R. McMaster tried to make famous. Okay? Basically, strategic narcissism we saw both in Cuba and I think in the recent events, and that's led us to be surprised by the actions that the adversary took. In the missile crisis, we didn't imagine that the buildup of American strategic offensive forces could have created the window of vulnerability, is what we called it when there was something similar later in the Cold War, that might lead a Soviet Union to be desperate and to take some desperate act. And I think similarly with respect to Ukraine, the US has not been watching what's actually happened from the Russian point of view over the period, basically since the end of the Cold War, but especially since 2007, Putin's famous Munich speech, and what a country like Russia, which when it got back on its feet and had military capability and petropower, might be likely to do. So first, necessity for strategic empathy, that is, seeing things from the other party's perspective in order to better understand what they're likely to do and shape their behavior. Secondly, the framing of the issue, both in the Cuban Missile Crisis and in the Biden administration's confrontation with Putin over Russia, there's been a lot of art in framing or defining the issue. In the missile crisis, Kennedy, when he gave his first speech after a week of deliberation, which basically revealed that we had discovered Soviet missiles in Cuba, talked about this secret, clandestine communist missiles in violation of Soviet assurances and in upsetting the established status quo. And the Biden administration has framed Putin's assembly of 100,000 plus troops on the border of Ukraine as the potentially biggest military invasion since World War II in an attempt to redraw the map of Europe and redefine the security order in Europe. So defining framing the issue makes a big difference, both in terms of domestic political support and also international support. Finally, resolution. There is a fascinating, they're competing myths and narratives about the resolution. I've written about them in my book, Essence of Decision. Others have written subsequently. The dominant narrative is the one the Kennedy administration promoted from the get-go, which is that we discovered their reckless adventure, confronted Khrushchev, brandished our military superiority, and forced him to back down. And that's been, I think, a narrative that continues. This is, some people call it the lesson of, finally standing up in Munich and forcing the adversary to retreat. Actually, it's much more complicated. And I don't want to take a lecture here, but I would say 2 points of the complication. First, you could, if you were doing cartoons, you could say, who folded first? That would be fascinating. You could have a back and forth, for students. On the one hand, for Kennedy, once he got to the final hour, which was the 13th day, we're just on the edge of nuclear war. He offered what I've called a magic cocktail that consisted of a public concession. So if you withdraw the missiles, we will not invade Cuba in the future. So secondly, a secret ultimatum, which was communicated by Bobby Kennedy to Dobrynin and then to the Russian government, which is within 24 hours, if you don't get your missiles out of there, we're going to act. So basically an ultimatum. And third, a secret sweetener, which said, we won't make a deal with you. There's no quid pro quo, but I'll just tell you, if the missiles are withdrawn from Cuba, within 6 months, the US Jupiters in the equivalent missiles that were in Turkey will be gone. And the Kennedy administration went to great lengths to keep that secret. Actually, I first found the clues to it when I was writing my book, Essence of Decision. Bobby then confirmed it. And on the 20th anniversary, 6 of the people who were inside and knew what Kennedy had done, including Bundy and Sorensen, wrote about it. So that's the American, I think, facts. On the Russian side, interestingly, at virtually the same time, Kennedy was making this offer of a magic cocktail, Khrushchev had determined that the risks of war had become too great and was taking action to withdraw the missiles. And you can even have an argument about the timing and who knew what at which time. But in any case, it's essentially in the same frame. And I think the big takeaway there and big lesson that's relevant is that in confrontations that run a risk of nuclear war, a serious risk of nuclear war, both parties have got to ask themselves about, do they want to play this hand out? And neither wanted to. So I give them both high marks, for the last round.
Graham, what is your take on the Ignatius thesis that this is the Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse?
Well, I haven't read the piece, so I'm at a disadvantage, and I'm a fan of David's, but it seems to me maybe it's cute, but not quite right. So indeed, if you say, if the difference is in terms of the stakes, who had the bigger stakes in Cuba, even in the Cuban Missile Crisis? Excuse me, there were missiles there which were, from Khrushchev's point of view and the Soviets' point of view, important for them to be sure that they had a capability to destroy the US and couldn't be vulnerable to a disarming first strike. So that's pretty important. And besides, they're there on center stage. For the US, Cuba is 90 miles away, yes, but and is with, quote, in our hemisphere, as JFK described it at the time. So I'm not quite sure about, how one compares the stakes. I think that in In Putin's case, though, since Ukraine is, in his view, essentially part of the Russian world, and he cannot imagine a Ukraine that is a part of NATO. And as he said, if you were thinking about Ukraine in the NATO, would you imagine a war between Russia and France and Russia and Europe? So I agree with the proposition that for him, the stakes are higher here. And I think actually one of the places I give the president himself actually, high marks, is right from the get-go, realizing that our stakes here do not include vital American national interests. And that's why he took any use of American military force to fight the Russians over this off the table. I think basically anticipating that given the mood in Washington today, you would soon hear the kind of howls we've heard, including a silly piece today in the Washington Post by somebody else saying the US should send troops to defend Ukraine. Biden took that right off the table, recognizing that in terms of the hierarchy of American national interests, the US has no vital national interest in Ukraine. And that's the reason why we haven't admitted them to NATO.
When we talk in the terms of national interests, the way that you are and President Biden appears to be thinking in these terms as well, the Cuban Missile Crisis ended favorably, largely on American terms. We didn't expel Castro, and there was the Jupiter Missile Agreement, but it largely came off. Khrushchev did have to back down, and ultimately it helped lead. It wasn't the only reason that he was deposed as the leader of the USSR. What we're talking about in the American case, and the reason that the Russians ultimately backed down was, of course, America had vast nuclear superiority over Russia at that point, but also it was conceded that this was the American sphere of influence, the Monroe Doctrine, and so forth. So what does that imply for Ukraine and Russia? We don't have to use the term sphere of influence, but we can still operate on that basis, much as both Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman did after World War II, and even successive presidents. There was no rollback of communism in Eastern Europe. So what kind of diplomatic modus vivendi would you envision in that area?
So Jacob, as always, one of the reasons I'm such an enthusiast for the Center for National Interest is y'all's ruthless realism. So I think it's worth, starting with even ugly realities. Now, the current American rhetoric, or I would say our declaratory policy, denies the existence of spheres of influence. Hillary said famously that, spheres of influence have been consigned to the dustbin of history. But I think it's worth asking yourself, if Russia today proposed with Cuba, two sovereign countries, to place in Cuba the same, something essentially equivalent to the Aegis Ashore batteries that we've placed in Romania and Poland, would we say, well, of course, there's no spheres of influence. Countries are free to make whatever arrangements they want to make that they think advances their security? Or let's imagine Putin and Maduro decide they're going to have a base in Venezuela. We would say there's a free country. It gets a chance to make its choices. No, not in your life. So there's a difference between de facto and de jure, or declaratory and operational. And I think we will recognize and have to recognize that Putin has the capability to deny Ukraine entering NATO without risking Russia attacking Ukraine. That's just a brute fact. And the failure to recognize that in 2008 by the Bush administration contributed to Russia's attack on Georgia and the separation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and the failure to recognize that in 2014 by especially the EU, more than the US, but the US complicit, I would say, led to Putin's taking Crimea. And we can say, we don't legitimize your occupation of Crimea. We still support and believe in the territorial integrity of Ukraine, but nobody is prepared to fight for Crimea wisely, because we recognize that would mean a war with Russia. So I think we will end up with some, I hope, a version of a recognition that we will have to take account of and integrate Russian conceptions of its interests in the European security order. Now, I don't find that all that comfortable because I'm an old Cold Warrior. I worked with enthusiasm for Reagan, and we entered into many agreements with the evil empire in which we constrained our behavior, for example, deploying missile defenses, as the price for getting them to restrain their behavior. We did this with the CFE agreement. We did this with transparency agreements. So I suspect that we will, I hope by the end of this, get back to a situation where we realize Russia, and especially Putin's Russia, has contrary interests to ours, absolutely contrary. And it nonetheless has power to act on the basis of its judgments. And we will have to take those into account as we figure out how to protect our interests, and especially taking account of that in terms of a hierarchy of interests, in which if a state is a member of NATO, we have made a commitment through Article 5 that an attack upon one is an attack upon all. And that's become to be interpreted as virtually, we will for sure fight for you. If you're not a member of NATO, which Ukraine, fortunately, from my perspective, is not, that's a different matter. We have to ask ourselves, are Americans prepared to fight for Ukrainian sovereignty, territorial integrity, freedom? I don't think so.
I doubt it. But there is a humdinger of a question from Melinda Herring of the Atlantic Council, who challenges this perspective directly and all but calls it unrealistic. She asks,
Good.
The United States does have vital interests in European security. If Putin is able to do what he wants in Ukraine, he will challenge the Baltic states and Poland. You, Graham, are drawing US national interests too narrowly. Please respond.
Good, excellent question. And as always, from a very smart observer. So if we imagine, just for the moment, that Putin acts and takes all of Ukraine. So he's ruling not just Crimea, but all of Ukraine. Will this be a big, big negative for Ukraine, for Europe, for US? Absolutely. And I think we should do everything we can short of war with Russia to prevent it. So we do have a real national interest there, but not a vital national interest. So I think actually, if to turn it slightly, so I think Putin, if you were a Ukrainian advocate, Putin may have been, maybe I'm looking too much for silver linings here, he may be one of the best things that's happened to Ukraine lately. Ukraine has not been a very successful state for the period since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's in fact poorer today in real terms than when the Soviet Union disappeared. Excuse me, say it again. Look at the World Bank's report. Poorer today than it was. So it's a failed economy, and its politics, I mean, look at its politics, not successful either. So this is actually helping build a sense of Ukrainian identity and a sense that actually Ukraine has got to succeed for Ukrainians, and also a lot of sympathy by other countries who hadn't thought much about Ukraine, but who are giving it more standing now. So maybe that that this boomerang for, I think Putin is foolishly promoting the cause that he's actually trying to extinguish.
One thing that we haven't talked about is the specter of nuclear war, which the Russian government is apparently accelerating its nuclear practice this month. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, of course, the shadow of nuclear war hovered over it and prompted Kennedy to essentially overrule his hawkish advisors who wanted to go in and take out the Russians. And we now know, of course, that there were, in fact, I believe, tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba that could have been launched on Florida. So Kennedy made the right call. He was judicious. After the Bay of Pigs, he had become more wary of the national security establishment, I think. Now, this prompts me to pose another excellent question from the Atlantic Council, this one from Robert Manning. He says, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, both JFK and Khrushchev were, of course, both terrified of starting a nuclear war, a huge factor in their decision-making. And listening to the contemporary American debate, not just over Ukraine, but also China and Taiwan, does it in fact seem that nuclear weapons and the consequences of employing them have become devalued? Today we hear talk of limited nuclear war. Have we in fact neglected and even forgotten the ominous lessons from 1945 to 1989?
So I would say absolutely. So 3 huzzas for that perspective. Just to briefly agree, but I'm just violently agreeing. First, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK thought there was somewhere between a 1 in 3 and even chance that this would end in a war, including a nuclear war, that would kill a couple of 100 million people. At the time, the arsenals were not as big as they are today. Today, we could maybe kill everybody. Okay, so you think about that, say, what? So as both he and Khrushchev looked over the brink, they felt existential nuclear danger. And it was real. And it was real to the people sitting around the table, thinking, wait a minute, we may end up destroying most of our country. That's what could be the outcome of this. And that the sense of nuclear danger was decisive, I would say, as a factor, both for Kennedy and for Khrushchev, when they finally got in focus what was going on. And Khrushchev was even more eloquent than Kennedy in their private communications about, if we both understand what's happening, he had this great metaphor about the knot and the rope. And if we both keep pulling on the opposite end of the rope, soon the knot will be so tight that even the person who tied it will not be able to undo it. So the genuine risk of nuclear war real. Second point, in the case of Ukraine, since the US is not sending troops to fight Russia over Ukraine, as I said, I think that's the strategic clarity that Biden exercised right from the beginning. The risks of nuclear war in this case are very, very low, because you would get to a nuclear war by having a conventional war, which then one of the parties would find themselves escalating to some demonstrative nuclear use or otherwise. I can give you scenarios, but
let me interject here, Graham, because this seems to me, let's say that Putin is overconfident. And some people are drawing parallels between him and George W. Bush on the eve of the 2003 Iraq War. They say that Putin is isolated, he doesn't have enough advice, and he has fallen for the myth that the Ukrainians will greet Russians as liberators. Now, what if he does go into Ukraine, and this is a willed war? There's no real casus belli for this war. I mean, this does seem redolent of 2003. I want to do this. I can do it. I'm going to do it. So what if it turns out to be nastier than he expects, and he gets not losing, but he's mired. And the Europeans and America are sending weapons. What's to prevent Soviet tactical doctrine from upping the stakes?
Well, okay, good for you. I think that's an interesting to try to, I think actually the parallel with 2003, nothing is exactly the same, but there's some similarities. So I like that. And at least from all of the analyses I've seen, and I think there was quite a good release of US military intelligence judgments in the Post last weekend, offering their, belief that if Putin decides to go, he can be in Kiev in 2 or 3 days. So the chances of this being a military success conventionally is huge, but nonetheless, if for whatever reason he got into the war, and if maybe, I don't know, volunteers or quote volunteers from other countries came to be fighting, and if he got bogged down, it certainly is the case that when the Soviets or when the Russians do their European war scenarios, they have invented a concept called escalate to de-escalate. And they've actually practiced this, in which they use one or several tactical nuclear weapons, so escalating to the nuclear level, in order to communicate, we're absolutely serious about this. If you want to play out a nuclear chicken game, let's go, okay? Now, whether Putin would be crazy enough to do that, I mean, the great good fortune of the recent history of the nuclear age is that we have not had a Hitler or a extreme risk taker who would get onto the nuclear escalation ladder and say, if you think you're man enough, top me. So actually the care that's been exercised both by Russian leaders and Soviet leaders and American leaders, whenever it came to the edge of our fighting each other directly, even in conventional terms, has been impressive. So for people that are asking about Biden's decision to make clear we were not fighting for Ukraine, if you go back, every time every president of the US since Truman has had a chance to choose between sending American troops to fight Russians and finding an alternative, we've decided the alternative. So in Eisenhower with the uprising in Hungary in 1956, you had freedom fighters slaughtered. We did not come to their rescue. Prague Spring under Johnson, 68, we did not come to their rescue. Georgia, we did not come to their rescue. That was George W. Bush. I went around the room, I think you and I talked before about Hadley's moment in which he asked everybody to record their view. You're prepared to fight for Georgia or not? No, okay. Obama 2014 with Crimea. So I think that shows a concern and caution about getting into a war with Russia that Russia is also shown the counterpart of, because it would put you on a ladder or an escalator that might end up with the use of nuclear weapons. And if you ended up with a general nuclear war, remember Ronald Reagan's line, a nuclear war cannot be won and must therefore never be fought. So the end of a nuclear war, your whole country is abolished, destroyed. Nobody would call that a victory.
Graham, there's another question about Putin and giving him a bite of the apple, as it were. It's from Rachel Oswald. And she says, essentially, if we were to accept some type of tacit agreement that Ukraine won't be part of NATO, would that be the end of it? Or would he feel empowered to demand more concessions down the road, missile defense systems, weaponry, American troops from Poland, Romania, the Baltics? I guess the way I think of it is Bismarck announces in 1871 after German unification, that's it. We are a satisfied power, no more. Is Putin a revanchist who's going to keep going, or is accommodating him in Ukraine, in fact, just another step on the road to the next crisis?
So good, a good question, and who knows? But I'll offer my 2 cents anyhow. Sorry,
Yeah, we're fine.
okay. Sorry. So what does Ukraine want? Sorry, what does Putin want? He wants the world. Okay, or at least he wants back, the world that he grew up in. The idea that the Soviet Union, which was a great superpower, collapsed, he says, was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century. So leave aside the Holocaust or World War II or World War I. No, it was the collapse of the Soviet. He genuinely believes that. He can't get over the fact that he lost. Soviet Union lost. I've often talked with Russian colleagues, and I said, I can understand why you're pissed, but you lost. That's what it is to lose a war. So they lost. Then they lost their empire. All of the territories they'd collected, the border of Russia is back to Catherine the Great. So the greatness of Russia, which was in its expanse, has been reversed. So what would he like? He would like the world back the way it was before. And our challenge, I believe, is to create correlations of force that will lead him not to take actions that'll be contrary to our vital interests and our even extremely important interests. So that means in the case of NATO, even though I would not have voted to invite the Baltics into NATO, I think our NATO expansion program was a mistake. The Partnership for Peace arrangement that the Defense Department I was working in at the time and that Bill Perry was the main advocate of would have been a much better alternative. But we are where we are. So given that we have NATO and given we have a commitment to the members that are members of NATO, I'm in favor of making sure we have the forces to make any action against those nuts. And we have to then communicate that to Putin so that he understands it. But at the same time, we have to be willing to engage in reciprocal restraints the way we did in the Cold War. So why did in the Cold War, back to the point I made before, did we continually agree in arms control agreements and others to constrain ourselves? Because that was the price of getting him to constrain himself. And then we had basically a framework for a long-term competition. I think in a long-term competition, Putin's Russia is in deep trouble. This is not a system that's going to work very well. He understands that. So we basically have to find a way to try to manage a process in which a Russia will, if you're really, really imaginative, when I'm in my romantic moods, I think that you could imagine a European security house in which there was some room for an uncomfortable Russia. But I think otherwise, as Johnson once said, they're either going to be inside the tent pissing out, or they're going to be outside of the tent pissing in. And I think we have to find some way to kind of get them to be part of a viable, safe European security order.
Graham, I always thought we won the Cold War too, but I feel obliged to note that there is a counter thesis that has gained increasing adherence, which is that after the Cold War, the United States fundamentally misread what happened. It was more that the Soviet Union collapsed than that the United States won. Furthermore, America misinterpreted the victory, sought to establish hegemony around the globe on the basis of this triumphalist reading of the Cold War, embarked upon these wars that boomeranged, and now, far from being the victor of the Cold War, it is the United States that is on the verge domestically of replicating the disintegration of the Soviet Union, that in fact, America is doomed and it is Russia and China that are on the march. Is that too stark for you?
Well, I would say provocative. Okay, so let me go through the pieces. So in part, this is the Chinese narrative, which the Russians and Putin also like very much. And there's about 5 layers of it. So if you take the first layer, was it more their collapse or what we did that provided a framework with which we gave them time to collapse? And I would say Kennan got it right. Containment was about a framework that resisted what they said was the inevitable advance of Soviet communism, to frustrate the internal contradictions, which essentially in time hollowed the place out, and then it collapsed. But that was the theory of the case. And I think we helped them. We helped the collapse where we could. If you look at the Reagan version of the strategy, it was to contain, but also undermine. And we were somewhat helpful, though I think they were so rotten, they would have eventually collapsed anyhow. Second question, post-Cold War, how did we play our hand? I would give us an F, okay, a failure. I think that we failed to understand that a defeated Russia nonetheless would have to be part of the European order, or else it would be outside the tent and would be forever a problem. So Churchill had the right idea: in victory, magnanimity. But that was not our choice. And therefore, in expanding NATO in a way that was threatening to Russia, as Kennan said, actually at the Center for National Interest, I remember because Dmitry and I were both there, he said about NATO expansion, this is 96 or 5, he said, this would be the biggest possible mistake in the post-Cold War period, from which we would not recover, because anybody who believed it would be possible thereafter to have a constructive relationship with Russia did not know what Russia was. And anybody who thought that once we started down the road to admitting new members, that would be the end of it, didn't know who America was. Now that turned out to be pretty good forecast. If I jump one further down, the unipolar illusions were deep illusions and led us off into unnecessary wars and almost 2 decades in the Middle East and $7 trillion and 15,000 American lives and many, many others of there. And then finally, I would say the problems within our society, which are the fundamental problems, are more of our own making than of the external environment. Maybe the triumphalism and maybe the wrong turns into Afghanistan and Iraq contributed to them somewhat. Certainly, they played a big role in discrediting the foreign policy establishment, no question whatever, and making many Americans think people in Washington don't know what they're doing. And so probably they contributed, but I wouldn't say were the main factors. But certainly when Putin and Xi met this week in Beijing, they always talk about the Americans falling apart, and they collect the evidence for it. And if they were to read the best American analysts of our problems, they have a lot of fodder.
Well, it's my incumbent upon me in my capacity as moderator, not just to pose my own questions, but those from the audience, which of course we welcome. Here's a good one from Henry Now of George Washington University, who says that you've established that Russia has the capability and will to invade. NATO has a long-term capacity to respond, but no real troops in the short term. Any diplomatic outcome, therefore, favors Putin. What do we give him?
Good. Henry, now I like reading. So Henry, good question. I think people are scratching their heads now. So I think for me, if it were, but I don't know how you would manage the politics of it, but I said back at the time of before Crimea that I could easily imagine an Austrian solution for Ukraine or a Finnish solution for Ukraine. And I remember we had a project here at Harvard, what is it called? Project for Economic Reform in Ukraine that I was involved with for 4 or 5 years. And I said to him, if you could grow up to be Finland, you would have gone to heaven. So Finland is an extremely successful society. It's a free society. It's economically, actually Austria has thrived under the arrangements that were made. So given the complexities of Ukraine in the psyche of Russia, whether it's Putin in that 5,000-word essay he distributed last summer, or Solzhenitsyn. So they somehow in their Russian kind of mythology and mysticism can't get over the Kievian Rus as the origins of their narrative about where Russia came from. And so there'll inevitably be some unusual relationship between these two countries if Russia is to be at peace for some period of time. Well, if the turnout, if you look at that 5,000-word essay, if you were trying to read for clues for good news, Putin says, well, maybe the relationship could be like the one between Germany and Austria today. Well, that's a very happy relationship today. Or he says, maybe like the US and Canada. Well, that's a pretty successful relationship today, even for the Canadians. So I think we will have to find something in that domain. I think the fact is that Europeans are not going to admit a new member to NATO. So there's a lot of misleading rhetoric about this in the Washington conversation. People say, well, doesn't Ukraine have a right to join NATO? To which I said, of course, they have a right to apply to join NATO. But NATO members have a right to accept or reject the application. You can apply to come to Harvard. The Harvard Admissions Committee has a right to admit some people and to pass on some others. So I think the chance that you get a unanimous vote in NATO for admitting Ukraine, given that Putin's threat to war with Ukraine, in 2008, when the Bush administration tried to do that, fortunately, in my view, Mrs. Merkel, who was the adult in the room, and the French, said no. That was a wise choice, I believe, both for Georgia and Ukraine. So I think we'll have to find something in between. And on the other hand, I would not give Putin a veto over anything, and I wouldn't compromise any of our principles. And I wouldn't recognize the legitimacy of his occupation of Crimea, because in the long run, Crimea was a part of the sovereign territory of Ukraine at the end of the war. And if, for analogy, the US never legitimized the Soviet Union's occupation of the Baltics. We didn't deny that was a fact, but we didn't legitimize it. And therefore, when the Soviet Union was falling apart, we were in, I think, a good position to encourage their emergence as free independent states.
Paul Hare asks if we have failed to recognize the diminution of American power in NATO and Eastern Europe, in contrast to the overwhelming superiority that the United States enjoyed during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, I'd like to add to that, just because it's something that some people in Washington think that actually, and this sort of relates to this question of Paul's, some people in Washington think we can stick it to Putin in Ukraine and follow a kind of Reaganite policy of counterinsurgency and ultimately toppling Putin from power. So what is your assessment of the capacity and fortitude of the United States in dealing with Ukraine? Are we living in the clouds, or do we have a realistic assessment of what we can do?
Well, good question. And Paul is always starting with the fundamentals. So you should start with a ruthlessly realistic assessment of the fundamentals. And there, I agree entirely with what he said. If you compare objectively our hand today and our hand during the Cold War, there's no comparison, virtually no comparison. And Americans haven't awakened to that. So basically, if you go back just with the numbers, I always try to keep remembering, the US had half of the world's GDP in 1950, so end of World War II. The US had a quarter of the world's GDP the end of the Cold War. We have about a seventh today. So that's just the substructure of power, and we can go through every other element. So that's point one. Point two, many people, not Paul, but I'd say most of Washington hasn't wakened up to the fact that Putin's Russia is now a powerful, great power. Fortunately, some people in the Defense Department have. So why in Mattis's 2018 defense strategy does he call officially, we now have two great power competitors, China and Russia? What does that mean? That means we recognize they have great power. So what power does Putin have? First, he has a military that's been rebuilt that can fight and win. I think actually I wrote a piece in your magazine, Jacob, a few years ago, in which if you had McKinsey do an analysis of Putin's Russia, they would come back and say, your comparative advantage in this world is in military that can fight and win. Because the Europeans have given up on militaries. They believe they're ceremonial. You have a military that you sent into Chechnya, they destroyed Chechnya, and they suppressed the terrorists, and you rule in Chechnya. You have a military that when Obama said Assad must go, that was Obama's line for Syria, Putin said Assad must stay. He sent his forces, Assad is there today. If you look at Crimea, Russian forces move in successfully. So they have a very serious military capability to fight, win, and achieve military objectives. Secondly, in the relationship with Europe, what keeps Europe warm and their factories running this winter now? Russian oil. Sorry, more than half of all the gas burned used in Germany comes from Russia. And can Russia slow that? And can you imagine this winter playing out the hand? German houses cold in order to punish Russia for whatever it did in Ukraine? I don't think so. And you could see in the face of their chancellor the other day, sort of not quite saying what Biden had scripted him to hope to say. So I think that when I play out the hand that the Biden folks are playing now, militarily, Putin has the high cards. In terms of economics, we're talking about strangling sanctions, and we're worried about inflation and oil prices, as well as Europeans and gas, complicated. The unity of the alliance. This could become, if it played out badly, Putin's dream of splintering the alliance. If the Europeans go one direction and we go another over trying to punish. And in terms of hybrid, they dominate. So I would say the Biden team has done a great job, in my view, taking a weak hand and trying to make as much of it as it can to set the stage for what I hope will then be serious diplomacy that'll find its way out.
Speaking of the hand that the U.S. plays, James Kitfield, who is a veteran military correspondent, asks about the Three Musketeers doctrine of the NATO of all for one, one for all. So his question is, you have all those Russian troops in Belarus. that are close to the Ukrainian capital of Kiev, but also to the Baltics and Poland. How do you rate the chances that Putin might move on a weak NATO country and have NATO modest tripwire deployments to the eastern flank been sufficient, or in fact, are they provocative in their weakness?
Well, again, a great question. So one of the reasons I would have voted against expansion of NATO, and especially expansion to the Baltics, is that these are essentially indefensible relative to Russia, given the proximity and the forces deployed. Now, Berlin was as well, so you have to remember that we managed to keep an enclave in Berlin with the tripwire force and the threat to end up going to war. So, but that's a highly risky posture and ought to be done in terms of your assessment of interest. So that point one. Point two, unfortunately, I think if we look at NATO, for most of the parties, their military capabilities are more ceremonial than operational. That's maybe too provocative a statement, but I think that German forces are not designed and trained and equipped to fight, nor are many of the other forces. So if it should turn out to be that Putin was a huge risk taker and were to do something, let's say, for example, in Latvia, which would be very close by, and which would be a 2-day operation or 3-day operation, then would we fight to retake Latvia? And if so, how? And what's the design of that? I have a case that I give to my students in my course on this one, and it just makes your head hurt. So when the Obama administration did a tabletop on this back in 16, I remember Susan Rice played president in the exercise, and Susan said at the end of it, her takeaway was basically, stuff. It was, we were screwed. So I think that fortunately, Putin is not a wild risk taker. At least we haven't seen him to be a wild risk taker so far. If we found a wild risk taker, then I think there would be extreme danger. So I'm in favor, given that we have the commitments that we have, and that the overall of NATO is as important as it is for the European order, that we should be more serious about the capabilities on the European side and on our side to make sure that Putin or any of his associates are not tempted to do something extraordinary. Yeah.
There's a question from Joseph Boscow who says or asks that given your admiration for a quote realist unquote view of this standoff and acceptance maybe of a de facto sphere of influence, what would you say to the notion of extending NATO membership to Ukraine and Russia as part of a deal to Putin? Something that Boscow says that Putin has previously mentioned. And I recall dimly from the early 1990s that there were some arguments that Russia should be pulled into NATO. Is this a pipe dream or a long-term realistic view?
So it's good there's twists and turns here, but I would say, given where we are now, Russia into NATO is an unrealistic view. Putin and the Russian military establishment see NATO as the enemy. Most of the Eastern and Central Europeans believe NATO is their security blanket against the enemy. So we've had the NATO-Russia Council, which tried to function, but which broke down last year. And I think to try to limit misunderstandings, but I think at this stage, that's unrealistic. What was realistic before, and this is pretty clear in, I think actually Mary Sarate's Not 1 Inch book gets this pretty close to right, that In 1996, we had a big choice to either expand NATO, which the Defense Department, Bill Perry, the Secretary of Defense, Saakashvili, the chairman, and all the staff, me, Ash, Joe Cruzel, who was the kind of the, in the boiler room, had I think, a powerful analysis that said this would be a fundamental strategic error. There is an alternative, which is not to leave the countries of Eastern and Central Europe and the border countries bordering Russia and the Baltics in the lurch, but instead there was something called Partnership for Peace, in which NATO, core NATO was the core, the centerpiece, and there were spokes for each country. So a special relationship with Ukraine, a special relationship with each of the Baltics, and a special relationship with Russia. And each one would be slightly different, but NATO would be the centerpiece. And then you would have to have, I call that different spokes for different folks. So you'd have different features depending on the particulars of each case. And for Russia then, would always be difficult because Russia is such a big, strong country, and once it recovered, and because of its history, would never be comfortable in virtually any arrangement. But if you go back to the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the Congress of Vienna, the brilliance of that, as Henry's first book explains, the brilliance of it was, you could have said at the time, Napoleonic France, forget about it, they're defeated. We should have an alliance against them. But the brilliance of the Congress of Vienna was that it created a framework in which they were defined into the common house, not outside. And that was a very painful, uncomfortable, difficult, didn't work perfectly, but you had about 100 years without a major war. So I think the idea of finding a set of arrangements, not that Russians will be happy with, because I don't think they'll ever be happy, but that they will live with, that they can, not try to overturn. And then I think the argument over time is either our society and other free societies prosper as they have, and their polities, their democracies function as they at least used to, and they're successful, and an autocracy of the sort that Putin's trying to create, basically an oligarchic autocracy or a party-led autocracy like Xi Jinping's, proves to be as unsuccessful as we Westerners who believe in liberty think autocracies inevitably turn out to be. That turns out, well, then we win. So I'm happy to have a long-term competition between freedom and a freedom-based democracy and a party-led autocracy or an oligarchic autocracy over time. But we'll have to try to work hard to avoid them getting into a war in the meantime, because I care about a war that could destroy us. Yeah.
Graham, winning always sounds good to me. And I hope everyone agrees that this was also a winning conversation and a fascinating one. And I want to thank you for generously taking the time to talk with me and to answer these varied questions. And I found it extremely stimulating. And we will have to continue this in a few weeks because things will change inevitably. Thank you again, Graham.
Great questions, and thanks for having me. I'm sorry that I went on so long on some of them, but each one of them would be a subject for a good topic. So look forward to continuing.
Thank you for listening, and that concludes our session.